Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to the opening of Melbourne Jewish Book Week. It's been a long time in the making. I'm Nicholas Brash, the festival director, and I'd just like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong peoples of the Eastern Kulin Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of this land. Pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and also acknowledge and respect the traditional owners of lands across Australia and their elders, ancestors, cultures and heritage. We have a real treat for you tonight, and in a moment I will hand over to your host and the producer of the show, Jaye Kranz. But first I just want to start by thanking our major sponsors, the Crystal Fund, the Sundrasia Foundation and the Gandor Foundation. Your support of this organisation is greatly appreciated. And I'll just point out that each of the events that we've got over the next 4 days has an individual sponsor. I won't name them all here now, but their names will appear on the slides at each event. Putting together a festival like this depends on a lot of goodwill and financial support. So over the next few days at the events, please take notice of these supporters and support them. That's how community works best. Thanks, of course, to our tireless committee and board, to our suppliers, our partners, and of course, the artists you're going to see over the next 4 days. And just before I hand over to Jaye, I just point out that tomorrow we have an enormous day of panels and interviews at Glen Ira Town Hall. Several of tonight's performers will be there again. If you haven't booked tickets, please do so. Check out the program later tonight on your website, on our website, not your website, our website, your computer, your phone, our website. Or for the really technically literate, you can scan your QR code on the programs we have outside, which will take you straight to our website. So without further ado, Jaye Kranz is an award-winning documentary audio producer and writer and an extremely talented curator of events like this. Please give a very warm welcome to your host for this evening, Jaye Kranz.
In the late afternoon of January 21st, 2017, a dove came crashing on my back lawn. He lay there, unmoving, wings splayed at unnatural angles. A vivid white dove, twice the size of the common doves and pigeons that adorn the roof ridges and eaves of my neighborhood. He dazzled on the grass, a bright, sudden riddle. I could have decided he was just a bird, from a pigeon fancier, say, a few streets away, or from the Racing Pigeon Union, 5.8 kilometres away, or the Pigeon Racing Centre a little further off. But no, as I stood at the sink, I couldn't dislodge a very different idea, that this pigeon had instead travelled 14,000 kilometres across the Pacific Ocean and had only now, after this extraordinary ordeal, made landfall in Brunswick. This was, after all, the day of Trump's inauguration. Just hours before, I'd watched him address the nation. He said of the small group who'd benefited under Obama's presidency, quote, "Their victories have not been your victories." I imagine while he was doing so, this white dove in front of me was addressing the task of long-distance flight, having decided that Trump's victory was not his own. The dove did seem, after all, implausibly tired, and I'd had a sense all day that somewhere far away in a northeasterly direction, something unnerving was happening. I simply conflated his arrival with Trump's. This brought his act into the realm of Odyssey. His plight and flight now seem to take on the proportions of the great epics, indomitable figures of strength and virtue who undertook feats that only the hero dared, setting out or returning home across vast settings, often on ocean currents, or in this case, I thought, a trade wind, an updraft, a prevailing breeze. Naturally, we named him Homer. Without objection, he allowed me to scoop his wings into my hold, his pulse pedaling too fast, I felt, against the pads of my forefingers. I set him down for the night in a box on a bed of pea straw, noting as I did a numbered tag on his leg in Royal Democratic blue. Homer made no attempt to leave, soon woven into the rhythm of our days. He lived with us for 2 years, the skewed awning of our shed, his perch of choice. After a year, he brought a mate. While she looked on, he demonstrated his landing approach onto the roof of the shed and the wild bird seed that would then materialize. He had trouble landing in the confines of our yard, which made feeding him on the lawn difficult. He'd try repeatedly, circling, attempting again and again, aborting just shy of the ground, increasingly distressed and weakened by his efforts. I don't think I'd appreciated the tiny titrations and minute adjustments that go into bird landing before this, particularly short-distance free flights, the finely honed balance of downstroke amplitude, wing beat frequency, and velocity, the even tension that must be found between two pairs of opposing forces, weight and lift, drag and thrust. The common pigeons had no problem alighting on the lawn, but Homer was simply too vexed by the challenge. We relented and moved a ladder to a permanent place against the shed. We began buying bulk bird feed and asking friends to please feed our wild pigeon if we went away. Plants sprouted on the shed roof from the cracked seed, clogging the gutters. Our neighbor applauded us for growing a crop of wild oats at such an inventive height. I'd whistle a tune to him whenever I'd see him circling overhead. It was the same 3-note melody my grandfather would whistle if we were separated on a bushwalk, a private cooey. When I did this, Homer would make a swift rooftop landing and stamp his feathered feet excitedly, as if in lieu of being able to chime in himself, he'd perform a 3-note dance on the tin instead. 3 notes passed down now through 3 generations of whistles and 1 wild pigeon. After a particularly savage storm at the end of 2018, we never saw Homer again. My partner and I have never agreed what came of him. She thought he met a grave end. I thought he'd sought a less skewed awning. We still look for him, our fierce feathered hope, our warm emblem of resistance. Homer left, the ladder stayed, which is all so many words to say, yes, a bird is always just a bird. Nature is out there wing beating, coursing its way through the world, whether we observe it or not, whatever virtues we attribute to it, however emblematic we deem it to be, whatever color we tag its legs, whatever name we give to its forms and phylum. As a friend of mine once put it, channeling a note of Auden, we care about the mountain, but the mountain does not care about us. We're constantly observing and conversing with the wilds we encounter, and in so doing, we hopefully come to see the thing itself more clearly, know it better, and by corollary, come to know ourselves more clearly. Or perhaps we might come to see something even more numinous. In the poet Mary Oliver's words, we might see through the heavenly visibles to the heavenly invisibles. Which brings us to our theme this evening, in our nature, to the bleed between our experience of external landscapes and interior states. They resemble one another. We borrow from one to furnish the other. We're instructed by both. We reveal ourselves through both. Tonight, festival guests dwell for you on this place between the visible natural world and the invisibles that come to bear on the way we see it and understand our place inside it. Thank you all for coming out this autumn night, and welcome to the opening gala of the 2022 Melbourne Jewish Book Week. What better way to start the evening than to take a walk, as it were? Our first guest has written 6 books, is senior editor at Eon magazine. She's published essays in the Paris Review, the Times Literary Supplement, and Granta. Writer, memoirist, and editor Marina Benjamin's most recent trilogy explores the midlife experience in real time. They include her account of a year without sleep with her book Insomnia, and her forthcoming title, A Little Give, on women's work. We start the evening with a piece she penned for you that has us venturing out with her into the London night. We sent someone with a voice recorder to Marina's home recently, so while she's our remote guest tonight, you'll have the pleasure of both her voice and recent morning bird song from her courtyard, 2 seasons away. She will be watching tonight's video after the fact, and will know if you don't give her a warm, raucous, if not distant welcome tonight, Marina Benjamin.
Well, hello everyone at Melbourne Jewish Book Week. I wish I could be there in person. I'm thrilled to have something to share with you this evening on the theme of in our nature. I'm not sure what else to say. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. I'm reading from a house that sits on a little square in northeast London, and I'm right at the top of the house in my study, looking out at some plane trees, which are reputedly the tallest in London in a private square. And right now, in the month of May, they give off numerous burrs, just fall off and kind of carpet the garden, this sort of yellow seed husks. So I'm always sweeping them up daily, and then amazingly, there's a new carpet the next day. So that we're very actively engaged with kind of the urban landscape here. So I've called this piece I and Thou in honour of Martin Buber. It starts like this. His ears prick up, his tail wags. He paws my leg, implores me with liquid brown cow eyes. But I have his measure. My hands are acquainted with every contour of this dog's little body, every crevice and hidden place, as if I carried a 3D model of him in my head. I wonder sometimes if this is a kind of sculptural knowledge, akin to the way artists see potential for form in a hunk of rock. Or perhaps it resembles the way tactility can infuse vision, a quality that one scholar I've read calls fingery eyes. A quality that lets us see snowflakes as fluffy, fallen leaves as crisp or dry. Whatever this kind of knowing is, a lived knowing, time-worn, love-worn, it lets me grasp the dog's wholeness as pocket-sized and indivisible. Come and see him. He is every shade of gold, copper-tipped at the end of his ears and tail, yellow gold along his flanks, interspersed with undertones of black, left over from his puppyhood. Along his belly he shades to champagne. His hair is soft with body oils. It is thick piled and lush to the touch. Usually it smells a bit ricey, fragrant with dried up wee. I like to run my hands through his pelt, feeling the dog's animal heat, concentrated in his compact body like something motive, an electricity generator powering up in the dark. It starts like this. He paws me, he implores, and I always give in. As soon as I stand up, he darts to the front door and noses his harness, looks back at me as if to say, "What are you waiting for? There's a moment that melts my heart every time, how he lifts his leg into the harness instinctively, helping me along, making things easy. And then we're off, headlong into the urban jungle, amid moving cars, pedestrians, a local green where the presence of other dogs drives mine insane. He likes a brisk trot, but it's all stop-start with him. Stopping, sniffing, snaffling, grubbing, panting, straining, scanning. At the first brace of cold, the fur along his back bristles up and stands on end. He wants this adventure. Lately, I've noticed that when I'm out walking with him, a subtle alteration pervades my being. Its changeling ways are not marked enough that anyone would notice. But I'm not myself, or I'm another self, or my self splits. I can't tell if this canine pull is chemical or material, psychic or cellular, but if another human should stray into our path, instantly I side with the dog. Something visceral asserts itself, an animal suspicion, the triggered riggings of a primal defense system, and my skin prickles and tightens. My head swells with sing-song chirpings and dull city rumbles. The full register of sound, everything amplified. My vision is super-focused. On my guard, I sniff things out. I detect earth and rot and humus and petrichor. I transgress my own boundaries, overflow. Should anyone cross me, I'm liable to snarl. Over time, the dog has primed me to look out for the unexpected, to think with sound, smells, and skin, swabbing mood shifts in the atmosphere as I breathe in and breathe out. In tune, our bodies move together, sensing which corner to turn and which way to lean into or out of upcoming foot traffic. In synchrony now, the lead in my hand is a balletic ribbon, our weaving dance an agile duet. Upon seeing a squirrel, time is held to a split-second standstill. The squirrel freezes on the pavement, paws extended in front, ready to run, its beady eyes locked on the dog. The dog breaks into a gallop, but his little legs straining at the harness only pedal the air. I'm seized by the dog's excitement, overwhelmed by an impulse to let go of the lead so that he can give chase. I shock myself with this proxy bloodlust, my enjoyment of the squirrel's fright, my blunt animal hunger. I am gunning for him. When we spy a fox flaming through the darkness, we both run at it, quickening pace together as it gallops off even faster into the night, and then disappears between the railings that border the green, now submerged deep in shadow. Back home, I need space to recover myself so the swirls of sights and smells can diffuse, and I can come down from a wired hide that construes every knock at the door as an invitation to vigilance. With my senses primed to see everything as having potential to come alive, it's as if the table in the hall might begin to rattle, and the stairs beyond it were pulsing a gentle throb-throb. For a while my limbs feel sprung. I go about tasks that call for activity as if I needed to shake something off. These days I no longer know who is leading who. The question is raw and open. But I know that the dog has reshaped me, infiltrated my barriers, turned me inside out. He has my measure, it would seem, even as I have lost sight of it.
Thank you, Marina. We traverse in this next piece a little further from home, along somewhat more undulating terrain. Our next guest is the author of no less than 9 books, spanning poetry, fiction, and criticism. Bryan Walpert's novella Late Sonata won Siege's 2020 Viva la Novella Prize, and his just-published novel Entanglement was shortlisted for the Jan Medlicott Acorn Fiction Prize at New Zealand's National Book Awards. His writing has appeared in journals and anthologies around the globe. He won the James Wright Poetry Award. Bryan has written non-fiction books about mindfulness and poetry, and about poetry and science. He's a professor of creative writing at Auckland's Massey University, and he's also, because at this point in his introduction, we've come to expect no less, an award-winning journalist who's written for more than a dozen publications, including the Washington Post. Bryan Walpert.
My interest today is mystery. Many of you will know the term beschert, a Yiddish word that means inevitable or preordained destiny. As the Jewish Chronicle puts it, it can apply to any happening which appears to bear the fingerprints of divine providence. It deals with mystery. The origin of the word is itself a matter of some mystery. Such things are appealing to a poet. Some say it comes from the German for bestowed or given, but I prefer the argument that it comes from the Yiddish word sher, to cut or clip, or as Moment magazine describes it, the idea being that beschert is something that has been shaped in a specific way. But the theme here this evening isn't mystery, is it? It's nature. The crossroads of nature and human nature, how our private selves are shaped or altered by encounters at the Walden ponds of our own lives. Well, beschert is, of course, most frequently used in the context of marriage, hence the phrase, finding your beschert. And when I think about nature, I always think of my wife. An ecologist, her interests are land use and climate change. She devoted her PhD years to studying the Denver, Colorado foothills where she'd spent formative years. And when she wasn't studying nature, she encouraged me to find joy within it. We spent weekends when we weren't working on our degrees in Colorado, tramping in the Rocky Mountains, tracking wildflowers, putting our noses to the ponderosa pine, which smells like butterscotch. She gave me a book on Colorado wildflowers, which led to a poetic sequence that was, in its own way, about the two of us. We decided to have our wedding ceremony at an outdoor amphitheater built lightly into a site overlooking Rocky Mountain National Park, about an hour from where we lived in Boulder. I'm Jewish, my wife is Catholic. Father Richard Dunphy, who taught at a Jesuit university in Denver, agreed to co-officiate with a rabbi. It was harder to find a rabbi willing to work with a priest. After a series of refusals, we were recommended to Rabbi Bahir Davis in Boulder. He had long hair tied into a ponytail, an iconoclast who refused to be boxed in by terms like Orthodox, conservative, reform. Rabbi Davis insisted on weekly meetings of an hour or so in the months leading up to the wedding, where we'd sit on his deck and talk about Jewish history and ideas while he smoked incessantly. I did ask Rabbi Davis about the chain smoking. Like, did he have to say a prayer before the first cigarette as before a meal? I'll relay his response. He said, Reform Jews say we can choose not to smoke, but it has to do with health, not religion. Conservative Jews say we smoke, but never near the synagogue. Orthodox Jews say we smoke, but we sold our lungs to non-Jews. But this is about nature, about crossroads and encounters. I haven't forgotten, though you have to understand that only human-made paths are straight. Little in nature knows a straight line. It was clear and beautiful the day of our ceremony. Father Dunphy and Rabbi Davis took turns in English and in Hebrew as they married us under a chuppah, its canopy made by my Catholic wife's mother, the poles by her father, the mountains behind us. We then went back to a lodge for drinks and dinner. We had placed a poem on each table from which you could also see out into the Rockies. A cousin called it Verse and Vista. There are no straight lines, only meandering paths that lead into mystery. We left Colorado 15 months later in 2004 for my academic job in New Zealand, a place I never expected to be. Though we lost touch with the rabbi and the priest, we never lost our love for the nature particular to Colorado. So when a decade later I had the opportunity for a sabbatical in Boulder, we returned with our 2 kids. When my parents came once from the East Coast to visit us in Boulder, we took them for an easy hike through nearby Chautauqua Park, whose paths wind around or up into the mountains. As we meandered, much perhaps as you feel this talk is doing, we happened across a man walking 2 dogs. The rules in Chautauqua require that dogs be leashed. This man was letting his run free. I wouldn't have said anything. My mother, who is from Israel, takes a different view on such things. She stopped and asked him to leash the dogs. He refused. So my mother said, "Let's go report him." I suggested we let it go, but at this point the Israeli was marching toward the ranger cottage. In the small cottage, the inside of which I had never seen before, while the kids perused the taxidermy displays, and my father accepted the aftermath of our confrontation with an equanimity born of 50 years of marriage and many such confrontations, my wife, my mother, and I approached the man sitting in front of a computer behind the desk. The man, who from memory wore the official green ranger shirt and a cowboy hat, stood up to talk with us as we explained, then turned to me to ask a question. As he asked, his face transformed before my eyes, reshaped itself into a new form. Has this ever happened to you, that the world reforms upon recognition? His question, which I can't recall, hung in the air longer than politeness permitted. My wife nudged me, concerned. The ranger actually waved his hand in front of my face and said, "Hello." "What's your name?" I asked him. He said, "Around here they call me Jake." I said, "What do they call you not around here?" I swear to you, he stood straighter when he said, "Rabbi Bahir Davis." Our rabbi, whom we had not spoken with in 12 years. We all took in the moment. He explained that he staffed the office from time to time to help out. He promised to follow up on the man with the dog. Then we were back in the park, looking anew at the conifers, the big open sky, the flatirons, as we walked away from the ranger cottage. As Norman McCaig wrote in his poem, Interruption to a Journey, it was left in that landscape. It left us in another. At some point, you have to decide your position on mystery and nature. Whether nature includes patterns and connections that have a sense of inevitability, beshert, the fingerprints of divine providence, whether there is a pattern to the meandering of our paths, or whether such events, however unlikely, are mere coincidences, whether we are just stray atoms colliding in a cold universe. This is, I think, a matter of character. There is no right answer. Or maybe the best answer is provided by the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, who said, "Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms, and like books that are written in a very foreign tongue." I will say this. the reason for that walk in Chautauqua Park. One reason, in fact, for the timing of my parents' visit was to mark our wedding anniversary. Rabbi Davis had married us 12 years before, to the day when our paths crossed in nature, when we encountered him in his guise as Jake the Ranger, because we happened to choose that spot in nature to take a walk with my mother, whose own nature is not to let things go. I said we had placed a poem on each table at our wedding. There was one more. As with many aspects of our wedding, the invitation itself had been a matter of some, let's call it, negotiation with our funders. In the end, the invitation was very traditional in the formality of its wording and formatting, except for one poetry passage, which I successfully insisted we include as a separate sheet. The passage is from a poem by Rilke called Love Song. It concludes, "Upon what instrument are we to spanned? And what musician holds us in his hand? Oh, sweetest song."
Before I introduce you to another pianist, a shout out to the talent regaling you with his original compositions tonight at the Ivories, pianist and composer Gideon Preiss. He's co-written and produced 4 critically acclaimed albums with the band Husky and will be releasing an album of solo pieces later in the year. And performing live behind the screen tonight, shadow artist and theatre director Lynne Kent. Before we had the honour of working with her, she was busy collaborating with the likes of the Victorian Opera, Circus Oz, and the Arts Centre Melbourne. Some of you will know our next writer, Simon Tedeschi, as a renowned classical pianist. After performing his first Mozart concerto at the Sydney Opera House at age 9, he's since performed in major concert halls and festivals throughout the world, been a soloist with Australia's major orchestras, as well as with symphony orchestras in the US and New Zealand. But tonight, Simon brings you the lilt of his words, having just won the prestigious Caliber Essay Prize and having just published his first book, Fugitive, part poetry, part prose, part fiction and non-fiction, trauma-telling and testimony. This book weaves threads ranging vast geographical and temporal terrain. His piece tonight, as you'll hear, manages, though shorter in length, to range similarly vast scales. Simon will be joined on stage by his wife, artist, painter, and 3 times Archibald finalist Lorabelle Spirovsky.
If it can be said that the cat, once worshipped, has never forgotten, the same cannot be said for the ibis. At my local park, ducks, geese and pelicans preen and pose. Moor hens mosey with their chicks. But the ibis hangs softly to the side, grooms himself, but otherwise seems unsure what to do. Wingtip to wingtip, he measures well over 1 metre. Eyes the black of nickel mines. A breast like crumpled paper. Scythe beak, periscope neck. Talons torn from tyres. Surely not a bird, but several birds stuck together, the way a child draws an adult, or Henry Rousseau painted the African jungle he never saw. Once he was the god of numbers, words, wisdom, learning, the moon and tides, the arbitrator of divine disputes and the heavenly scribe. Now he's a spy, unable to recall the specifics of his mission. What brought the ibis from eternity to our dumpsters and downpipes? The ibis's story begins over 4,000 years ago, during the second intermediate period of ancient Egypt, roughly the time that Joseph is appointed vizier to Amenemhat III. Once the pharaoh was not just a ruler, but an immortal god, who in death would take his place alongside Ra the falcon, Nun the frog, and Amun the man. But around 1400 BC, everyday people, priests, tradesmen, merchants, women for whom childbirth often meant an agonizing death, those whose lives were short but felt long, bone-weary from tending the land, hauling stones over sand, peddling wares in bazaars. All of these people began, quite understandably, to seek eternity for themselves. For the first time in many centuries, an average citizen was, for a price, able to attain immortality, just like the pharaoh. Known today as the coffin texts, these spells or incantations, if chanted with passion and piety, would allow the dead to cast off their earthly form and proceed without interference from scavengers, grave robbers, vengeful spirits, sandstorms, to Duat, the underworld, a new place of existence among fields of reeds, streams, and sycamore trees. Waiting at the threshold to Duat would be the jackal Anubis, god of the dead, and the ibis god, Thoth, holding a little black pen. There, the petitioner would recite a set of 42 negative confessions indicating that they had not committed certain crimes.
I have acted with purity throughout my life.
Anubis would weigh the ostrich feather of Ma'at, or cosmic balance, against the deceased's heart, whereupon Thoth would record the result in his spiral notepad. Only if the feather was lighter or equal in weight to the heart would the petitioner be permitted to live on in death, which for the ancient Egyptians was like the deepest sleep.
I have not disturbed the peace of any man.
But if the numbers were out, even by a bit, the heart would be chomped to bits by Ammit, the savage lioness. For an ancient Egyptian, there was no worse fate. A devoured heart would mean that a father, mother, brother, daughter, or friend had been expunged from existence. Across the desert, a new deity was jostling for power, a Canaanite storm god with an unutterable name who could turn himself into a bush, a wrestler, a pillar of cloud, a flame, or simply a formless void that drove otherwise reasonable men to madness.
I have not worked witchcraft against the king.
This God tolerated no rivals and ruled over a people united not by land or force, but an idea. Early in his reign, one of this God's disciples, Isaiah, wrote that the world had fallen from grace and that terrible judgment was imminent. On that day, so it was said, pitch and sulphur would reign over the world, drowning each man, woman, and child in tarry blackness. Only the most loathed of animals, such as the ibis, would remain. Then another disciple called Moses, clutching a staff and stuttering with rage, used the ibis's beak as a weapon to destroy the Ethiopians and their serpents.
I have not told lies.
Only to turn around and declare the ibis unclean, too loathsome even to be eaten, along with all other animals that feast on the dead or don't chew their cuds, scavenging birds, shellfish, and pigs. Then came the Persians, Greeks, and Romans, all of whom slashed and hacked at the ibis, so that his feathers, once perfectly white, became matted with mud and blood.
I'm not a man of violence.
By now, it was too late to escape his fate. The world, having changed, had no room left for a lanky carrion bird. Egypt was vanquished. The old ways had gone. There were no empty spaces left on earth. And then someone decided that we needed a god that looked just like us. It's around this time that Thoth, the great god of time, begins to lose his bearings. Strabo, a historian from Asia Minor, writes in AD 20 of a strange bird in the back streets of Alexandria, feasting on our food and corroding our crops.
I have not ruined another's food.
Then, for 40 generations, we hear almost nothing, that is, until Hieronymus Bosch's painting, The Garden of Earthly Delights. In the middle panel, close to the left, if you look very, very closely, Thoth is being hoisted to the sky. It's unclear whether those lifting him are worshipping or sacrificing the, by now, pagan god, whose face is marked by a downy sadness, whose eyes are blank and strange, whose expression cannot be read, and whose likeness comes at the dawn of an era when humans stopped casting God in their own image and became gods themselves. It's clear that Thoth is no longer worth worshipping, but nor is he an outcast. That will take a little longer. Apart from some obscure accounts from French naturalists, Thoth disappears from written record for another 500 years. It's not until the middle of the 20th century, on the underside of the world, that one can find the sunken god, head buried in mangroves and mud, withered after tracing the line of the sky, to a bloodshot land populated by men and women who call him Ganyadju, or large bird who craps.
I have not stolen others' land.
This hefty continent, with its mangroves and mud, more than any other resembles the Nile, the great waterway over which Thoth once reigned supreme. And this is where his story should end, with Thoth resting his funny little head. But sometime in the mid-40s he was shaken awake by others for whom time had been torn in two by war, famine, and fatigue, others with an ancient lineage of their own, but not half as old as his, others seeking succor in new homes built right on top of his.
I have not stolen what belongs to God.
Thoth's mangroves were crushed, his waterways drained, his topsoil dredged, and once again the proud but scraggly god scaled rushes and ranges, forests and flight paths, seeking lands that could perhaps be shared. For someone whose word was once the arbiter of eternity, the ibis had become remarkably skilled at changing with the tides, the very tides he'd once controlled. Thoth found the city. He who created numbers and words, and therefore poetry and poets, now sits in laneways and embankments slurping McFlurries, sculling halal snack packs. On a sunny day, when families soak up the sun, He might filch a sandwich.
I have not stolen grain. I have not carried away food.
His stomach lining has changed. It's carbs he craves.
I have not snatched away the bread of a child.
Yet having raised his home, having forced him to such indignities, we mock him. We see him and walk the other way. There are calls to cull him.
I have not uttered curses. I have made none to weep.
Deep below the sands of the Fertile Crescent, the old gods snore. They don't plan on waking up. The pyramids of Giza have their own webcam. Migrating birds are tagged and tracked across continents. Egypt is included in my mobile minutes. Sphinxes leer over casinos. The sun exfoliates the Amazon.
I have not placed myself on a pedestal.
But my scruffy friend does what he's always done. He survives, and this time he's lost his little pen.
I have done no evil.
The grimy ghost in the dirty suit, still with his mask and goggles on. He who refuses to meet my glance or let me anywhere near him, even though I love him wildly.
I have terrorized no one.
Continues, even on tarmacs and traffic islands, to weigh our human hearts against the cosmos. And the results don't look good.
I have not transgressed the law.
Each of us stand at the threshold to do what?
I have not made anyone cry.
Each has failed the feather test.
I have not eaten the heart.
Let Amit eat our hearts. Thank you.
When I was thinking for the first time about tonight's theme, one thing in particular sprung to mind. It was an interactive piece I'd seen in the New York Times on the sinkholes ravaging the Dead Sea, swallowing it in great abrupt gulps, reshaping the lowest place on Earth beyond recognition. There are now 6,000 sinkholes on one side of the Dead Sea alone. There was something about this news being extreme enough, violent enough, awful enough, and unexpected enough as I sipped my morning coffee in bed that made me feel like my mattress was full of silt, as if something had been breached between my morning, myself, and the shifting world. I was tasting coffee and salt and the guff of hydrogen sulfide. I remember bobbing on that sea at the age of 6. I remember the sting in my groin and grazed knees from the salt. I remember the stillness of that place, the safety I felt in the peculiar weightlessness of that body of water. At 34% salinity, 7 times saltier than the ocean, floating was effortless. For the first time, I was less dense than the water I was swimming in, and this new experience of displacement made for a kind of cocoon. My family and I had driven down in an old blue combi van from our rental apartment in Haifa to this place on the edge of the Judean desert. Much of the way down, I'd been put to use for my gravitational advantage over the pop-up roof that housed the hammock beds. The bracing no longer held. The roof kept popping on the highway, and I hung from the roof handles for a considerable part of the journey. Now I watch slow aerial footage over the area we would have parked our van when we finally arrived in the seaside resort of Engedi. The camera panned over the deserted Paz petrol bowsers, palm trees pitched on angles stripped of fronds, the derelict cafeteria and outbuildings. Tufts of desert grasses peppered with uneven desert grasses peppered the uneven ground, growing over curbs that marked out places once peopled with tourists seeking the healing waters and black mud. The faint arrows left on the overgrown parking lots, the faded dotted center lines, now a roadmap for ghosts, an epitaph for tourists who pass through, as strange as a crop circle in a rough meadow, an eerie obituary, not just to days in the sun, but to the ancient history of that place. A place now dotted with gaping pits 60 feet deep, strewn with calcium deposits, scuttled air conditioning units, collapsed roofing, wires and pipes bulging like veins, piping nowhere. The stretch of nearby highway we arrived on buckled and collapsed. Standing at the Dead Sea recently, a water management and environmental engineer said, "Even the devil is not here." I wonder if this is because in this human-made catastrophe, we did his bidding for him. There are fewer roads out of this place we've come to than there were roads in. We have all lost this place now. But until a landscape is entirely lost, it's full of arrows, markers, pointing to things that once walked that way. Sometimes they're still there for us to track back over. Sometimes, as we'll hear in our next piece, even if we never step foot in those landscapes, we can recover those paths that came before through the way we live our days. Kira Maya Phillips is the co-author of The Misfit Economy, a book which chronicles stories of creativity and innovation from the underground economies and grey markets of the world. She shared her research findings for the book with the House of Commons, Google, the Barbican Centre, Cambridge University, and 10 Downing Street, among other notable addresses. A former journalist for The Guardian, as well as a former economist, she's the co-founder of The Point People, a collective of innovators, artists, and entrepreneurs committed to driving systemic change for a more equitable society. She now teaches English and history in Sydney and writes the bookish newsletters Marginalia and Snail Mail. Research for Kira's book took her to pirate prisons in Somalia, tunnel networks below Paris, Amish camel farms, and ganglands in Cape Town. Tonight, though, she reaches back to the landscape of her forebears. From Sydney, Kira Maya Phillips.
My grandfather always sat on the same chair. It was clover green, perpetually fraying at the sides despite constant repair, the fabric insisting, perhaps, that it had done its time. Memory is an impure and fraying thing. The act of remembering, like my grandfather's chair, is precarious. The more we long to bring forth a memory, the more it shifts and changes. With every recall, some fray falls away, others remain. New ones, perhaps, are added to the fabric of the evocation. My grandparents arrived in Kiryat Gat in 1955, a small city in the south of Israel. Back then, it was a refugee camp, one of the many that slowly transformed into towns, where people like my grandparents, immigrants from Morocco, tried to build some kind of life. They bought their first and last home in 1960, a minuscule one-bedroom apartment on the top floor of a walk-up. I remember still, in that impure way that we recall, how the tiles in the living room coalesced, in my mind, to create the shape of a wattle tree, its branches spilling over from under the worn mustard rug, the thick trunk winding its way down towards a dining table the color of deep oak, tiny, in my memory, yet magically large enough for their 7 children and their many children to mark the Shabbat every Friday night. Pesach was, for my grandfather, the holiest of Jewish holidays. Our yearly seders were long, lively, full of the kind of joy he knew was transient. Children asking questions, curious about the meaning of the bitter herb, the shank bone, the boiled egg. Aunts and uncles arguing about the particulars of the story, matzah cracking all over the table. To him, this was a moment of being, when the world seemed to submit, to split open, to give you everything you have ever envisaged. Year after year, my grandfather cleaved away at the simplicity of the Exodus's grand narrative. To him, the story spoke of fragmentation, of ambiguity. When the Israelites crossed the parting waters, his own exile is alive in him. As they sing the song of the sea, they stand right on the fault line, right between life and death. My grandfather insisted every year on opening the door for Elijah. He looked at each of us, and he quoted Malachi in his quiet and very kind voice. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet, and he will turn the heart of fathers to their children and the heart of children to their fathers." We summon Eliyahu Hanavi, he believed, to remind us where hope lives, in the soul, in the geography of our internal landscape, in the act of turning our hearts to one another. If he'd lived in the kind of world where he could have encountered Emily Dickinson, I'm sure that he, poetically inclined as he was, would have drawn from her image of hope as a bird, a thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. Memories rhyme. I'm walking with my grandfather on Harari Street in Tzfat, a holy city burrowed within the Upper Galilee in northern Israel. I am 12. By the following year, he would be gone. I see the oldest synagogue in an already ancient city, built originally to honor Eliyahu Hanavi. I see the old Tzfat cemetery. My grandfather points to the grave of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Arizal, the great Kabbalist. I hear him still, relaying what the Arizal said, that everything and everyone is imbued with divine, luminous sparks, shards of light that fell from a world so luminescent that it burst, the lustrous fragments landing on all people and hidden still deeply within everything and everyone. There he is, once again worshiping our internal landscape of beauty, the place within us, as the poet John O'Donoghue puts it, where you have never been wounded. I can imagine, though he never said so, that my grandfather often needed to visit this unblemished region of his soul, that he needed to hold on to what Samuel Beckett called that strange thing, whatever it is, that helps us to live on with our wounds. He was born in the high Atlas Mountains, in Ouarzazate, the door of the desert, a city in south-central Morocco, cradled by mountains to the north and desert to the south. He grew up in the home where he was born, one room made of adobe and rammed earth, where he heard his father, a rabbi, read from the Torah every day. He moved to the seaside city of Casablanca, still in Morocco, as a young man, carving out a small spot in its teeming port, selling from a stall piled high with avocados, clementines, persimmons, and oranges. By then, he had a family, my grandmother, 4 children. One night, on his walk home, hauling heavy bags of unsold produce, his blue knitted kippah clipped firmly to his hair, he was viciously beaten. He lost sight in his right eye and would struggle to hear clearly for the rest of his life. So together with his family, he boarded a ship to Israel. It set sail from Casablanca, stopping in Marseille, where my mother remembers the scent of the air, salty, still with traces of the familiar North African spices and smells of her youth, ras al hanout, turmeric, cumin, toasted almonds. When they arrived, Israeli immigration officers asked my grandfather what he'd like to do. He said he wanted to till the land, to build the country, to help it to grow. Like many Moroccans, they were sent to where I began this story, to the south. My mother and I left Israel shortly after my grandfather died, not long after that trip to Sfat. The silence created by his absence was its own shard of light, so pointed in its pain and longing that it pierced everything. I returned to Israel 7 years later as a young university student. Perhaps I was ready, I thought, to sit in that longing. But my return to these landscapes pushed me further away from my grandfather. One night in central Tel Aviv, I was sitting down for dinner with two fellow students, both Jewish expats from Berlin. As we were finishing our meal, one of them began to express his disdain for Moroccan Jews, who, in his opinion, had only brought filth and illiteracy to Israel. His ancestors, on the other hand, had infused the new country with superior culture, the symphonies of Tchaikovsky, the prose of Tolstoy. He was half right. My grandparents were illiterate. My grandmother couldn't read. The only word she could write was her own name. My grandfather had memorized the Torah and other religious texts. The stories of the Exodus, Eliyahu Hanavi, and Rabbi Luria were part of him, but he couldn't read and he couldn't write. I said nothing that night as he denigrated the bodies from which I'd emerged, the minds and the hearts that made me, and that despite their illiteracy, or perhaps because of it, taught me more than any idea that has come to me from the culture that he held in such high esteem. I can say this now, here, tonight, but in that moment, and in so many that followed, I internalized the shame that he laid on me. When I emigrated to London 3 years later, I broke ties with my past. I refused that difficult dance between who I was and who this new country was asking me to be, that uncomfortable middle space every immigrant understands, that double identity. But the gates of the West had been flung open. The further away I moved from the Atlas Mountains, the arid air of Israel's south, the continents of my forebears, the more I assimilated. Gradually, I lost my distinctness. I became, in a way, anonymous, a casualty of what Edward Said called the unhealable rift between a person's true self and the self's true home. My native languages, Hebrew, Spanish, receded. Soon I was finding it almost impossible to communicate with my mother and my grandmother. Our conversations were stunted and awkward. I couldn't express the mundane nor the meaningful. I could eat the food of my ancestors, couscous laced with cinnamon and smen, Moroccan preserved butter, chicken and vegetables radiant like an early winter sunset, the deep reds, browns, and yellows of paprika, cumin, and preserved lemons. But I could not or would not honor the hands that passed these flavors down. This fracture between the internal landscapes that shaped me, the adobe home of the Atlas Mountains, the cramped apartment in Kiryat Gat, the walk in Tzfat, and the assimilatory demands of belonging was too much to bear. The dissonance made presence an impossibility. It's hard work hiding what made you, seeking to replace what is ultimately so much part of you that achieving such a feat would be nothing less than self-erasure. I left the UK for Australia a decade later. When I arrived here, I felt porous, almost formless. I had lost, in a way, the identity that I'd paid such a heavy price for. But some elusive, unidentifiable force led me back to my roots. Perhaps it was the passing of time, or maturity, Or maybe because I found myself in the land of the wattle tree itself, like the one I was so mesmerized by as a child, as I stared at those tiles in the living room of my youth. So I began to carve my way back towards the beginning, towards that which was, so undeservedly, the subject of such shame. I now leave the door open for Elijah's whisper of hope, to hear the voice of my grandfather, to let those fragments of light in, to see those old horizon lines now etched irrevocably into the landscape of my soul.
Karen Hitchcock is a physician and author of fiction and non-fiction. Karen worked in major city hospitals for 17 years before shifting to private practice. Her first book, Little White Slips, won Best Short Fiction Collection at the Queensland Premier's Literary Awards and was shortlisted in the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award. She wrote the quarterly essay, Dear Life, and as a regular contributor to the monthly, she penned the much-loved essay column, The Medicine, later turned into a book by the same title. Bringing a perspective described as insightful and deeply humane on things medical, natural, and beyond, please welcome Karen Hitchcock.
George grows the magic mushrooms in the bathroom of his west-facing apartment 20 floors above mine in the middle of the CBD. He's experimented with growing medium, heat, moisture and cloning for over a year and is now harvesting 10 grams dry weight a week, enough to well and truly blow 2 mines. He's 85, and the way he sees it, he has 2 options: the mushrooms or Nembutal, which is the barbiturate used to euthanize humans. In his medicine cabinet, he has 2 bottles of Nembutal, one from a guy in a euthanasia club, which is well past its use by, and a nice fresh bottle from India, which he bought with Bitcoin on the geriatric Silk Road. We see each other in the gym. He pedals slowly on a stationary bike in his slippers. I hit the treadmill, the rower, the elliptical machine, sweat pooling in my runners. We say hi in the elevator, both of us dressed like medical specialists, suits and polished shoes, though he'd retired decades ago. Then he stops me in the foyer, wants to talk doctor to doctor, asks me to sit with him when he eats the mushrooms and journeys within. He thinks it's his last chance to clear his fog of weariness and despair. Homegrown psilocybe cubensis and 6 hours of my time upstairs, or suicide. I flee my job as a staff specialist in the fancy city hospital with rot at its core. I pack up my glossy apartment and move full-time to 24 acres in the ranges, the only thing I have left after a handful of divorces. The land is forested with eucalyptus and pine, a sunny mud brick house in a clearing. There's an established orchard and vegetable patch. I have no idea what I am doing. It's completely silent inside an apartment, hermetically sealed from the heavy metal of sirens and traffic, from the massive humans flowing down the street like corpuscles through a vein. The country house is permeable to the cockatoos, kookaburras, mating koalas, my rooster, the frog opera, baritone and soprano, ducks at the back door demanding breakfast. They push life inside. I have no idea what I am doing, but I do not want to leave. I start a small clinic prescribing medicinal cannabis for people who can't sleep, feel sad, or are in pain. It doesn't cure anything, but it sure can make you feel good. I start planting trees, like witnessing a miracle they grow, like witnessing homicide. The local mob of kangaroos eat any tree under 2 metres to the ground. They kill dozens of them, including a grove of snow-white Betula jackmontai saplings. Still hungry for exotics, the kangaroos leap over the rabbit-proof fences and eat our entire crop of summer vegetables in one night. George comes to visit. He keeps telling me not to plant mature trees. Young trees take better. I ask him if he has a gun, because if he has a gun, I promise that I'll plant a couple of young'uns for him. He laughs easily now. He had his mushrooms a few months ago, and for 5 hours he was 7 years old again, sitting back in that room in Hungary, unable to leave until he can speak the language fluently and without accent, or what remains of his family will face slaughter. Afterward, he says he feels light and he has no idea why. I worry about things like global food supply chains and work out how much I need to grow to feed all of my loved ones all year round. It's a lot and I'm panicked. What about drought, floods, fire? My friends politely smile and think I've gone crazy. We're in a pub, it's warm with light. The wine is plentiful, our clothes are very nice. Of course everything's going to be all right. A year later, the city is locked down hard. My friends now think I'm a prophet. My world shrinks to a kingdom 24 acres in size. I'm the Prime Minister and head of aesthetics. The resident mensch is the Minister for Defence. He studies towards a certificate in farming skills from the University of YouTube. I spend the entire treasury on trees. He irrigates the rapidly expanding gardens and erects a professional-grade kangaroo-proof fence around the entire property. He now knows all about cherry beetle bug slugs. There are now enough eggs and pumpkins and zucchinis and greens for all of my friends. We pick baskets of saffron pine mushrooms and find secret patches of the magic kind. George is miffed that I'm so happy about that. Why do you need them? I can grow more than you could ever find. I breathe, I listen to music, my fingernails are filled with soil. I'm tuned into the season's daily effect on my garden, bees gorging on blossom and unfurling leaf. I become obsessed with Japanese maples. A local nurseryman advises me to stick to 1, maximum 2 varieties, or, he says, things could look messy. My plan is to make every inch of the place a riot of beauty and colour and surprise. I line winding secret pathways with rare Japanese maples that look like bamboo or cannabis or bright green waterfalls, maples with red, orange, pink and white leaves, all posing next to each other like glammed up movie stars at an after party. I read books about the vast underground fungal mycelial network, linking trees and giving nutrients to those in need. A low-cut trunk, without leaves to photosynthesize, is kept alive by its neighbours who send food through the fungal network. They're out there sharing. I spread truckloads of mulch and mushroom compost to help enrich the soil. I stand still. I am no longer separate or the centre or even a capital I anymore. My mother starts dying. Melanoma blooms and rampages her major organs. She's given 2 months and directed to swallow untested poisons which render her bedbound. I've been a difficult daughter. She's been a difficult mother. Our relationship has been fractious, but she'd sent me off into the world so she could have some peace while I rejected her, and where I spent 25 years becoming adept at caring for old, dying people, so that I'm ready for action when she needs me. I move her to my place and, at her request, throw all her pills in the bin. She gets out of bed, asks me to take her op shopping and sets up her sewing machine on the dining room table. Each morning I ask her what she'd like for dinner. She turns her face upwards and thinks, vegetable dumplings and cherry ice cream, or osso buco and lemon meringue pie. I take to the kitchen and we share these joy-filled last suppers every night for a year. Winter comes and a storm levels half of the forest. All through the night, we hear the wind scream and the trees fall with deep bass thumps. I've never heard a sound quite like it. Our beds vibrate. Those beautiful old trees. Our long driveway is strewn with trunks as if God was playing a little game of pick-up sticks and lost interest. The State Emergency Service is overwhelmed, so the Minister for Power Tools fires up his chainsaw. 8 hours later, my brother can take my mother to his place until we get power again days later. The lockdown goes on forever. George dies, cause of death best left unspecified. I join a major university psilocybin trial and am trained as a psychedelic therapist, whatever that is. I join another trial using psilocybin mushrooms for people who are dying and terrified. The psilocybin is the therapist, really. Fungi doing what they do, delivering nutrients where they're needed. My mother says she's not afraid of death, but wants to make it to spring. The community palliative care people arrive in masks with a hospital bed that I set up in front of a wall of windows looking out over the gardens. She watches the crocus emerge, the hyacinth and daffodils. The last 4 days of winter, she can't get out of bed. She opens her eyes on her second last day and for the first time doesn't ask about dinner. She looks outside, smiles, and whispers, beautiful. When it comes down to it on the final day, she doesn't want to leave. And who can blame her? Afterwards, we're all quiet, and the room is filled with billions of tiny glowing particles dispersing, the colour of stars.
Mireille Juchau is a novelist, essayist, and critic. Her first two novels, Machines for Feeling and Burning In, made appearances on the Vogel and Prime Minister's Literary Award shortlists. Her third novel, The World Without Us, won the 2016 Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for Fiction. It was also longlisted for the International Dublin Literary Award and shortlisted for numerous others, including the Stella Prize and the New South Wales Premier's Literary Award. Mireille's criticism, essays, and reviews have been published internationally. In 2020, she won the Walkley Pascal Prize for Arts Criticism. She's the former fiction editor of Heat magazine, and her recent work has been published in Heat, The New Yorker, The Monthly, Lit Hub, and the LA Review of Books, among others. Tonight, Mireille brings you an unpublished part of a suite of works she's working on about the afterlife of war, specifically a feverish trip to southern Italy to look for traces of a relative who stayed there after she was liberated from the camps. Mireille Juchau.
I returned to my hotel at dusk. I didn't want to walk alone at night past the Casa Pound headquarters or the walls graffitied with Bari fascist crew. I didn't want to enter the dark underpass or take another taxi after the trip from the airport. When the driver skidded to a halt, I looked up at the hotel's sign. It was partly obscured by pines, so all I could make out was hot Nazi. Now I wondered where to eat, in my room or at the poolside restaurant where conference delegates gathered and wedding guests hurried by with diaphanous clothes and kids in hooded towels left wet footprints which vanished instantly in the heat. I decided instead to swim, but when I took off my clothes I saw in my reflection that yesterday's angry purple rash had spread. Would this alarm the pool attendant or the guests on lounges in the fierce August sun? I searched my room instead for something to tide me over till dinner, then realised the room had no minibar. Had I been assigned a room for someone who couldn't be trusted to confess to having used the minibar or to being left alone with its contents? I tried not to think about how I'd ask the elderly locals about the time the town had hosted the Jewish survivors from the camps, but now could not face inquiring, either because of the fascist graffiti or the exertion of the long day of walking, or the man in the old town with guns tattooed on his sacrum and at his neck the imperial eagle, which I associated with the Nazi regime, though I told myself, don't be stupid, the eagle is also the symbol of Rome. I could no longer trust what my gaze took in. It seemed only to settle on what might incriminate, and so I didn't immediately believe it when I opened my bag to find my swimmers and realised that someone had hung my clothes in the wardrobe. It was disturbing, this violation of the hotel contract that pretends a stranger doesn't enter your room each day and while tidying rifle through your bags, just as we pretend that the hotel bed hasn't been slept, eaten and fucked in by hundreds of others and retains traces of their fluids. On the other hand, this was so far my most intimate contact with any living soul in Bari. I've imagined this trespassing, I thought. It was simply part of my fever, and now I laughed at my plan to track down the legendary Maria who sold fried polenta in the old town and who, because of advanced age, might recall the 500 Jews who'd stayed here in 1946, and specifically my relative, Renata, who travelled here alone after Theresienstadt, Auschwitz and Mauthausen, and was, said my grandmother, irretrievably damaged. But what were the odds? And what if Maria recoiled at my question, or berated me because she approved of the Bari fascist crew, or was the proud grandmother of the chief crew member? After today, I could no longer guess who might welcome my questions about the town's history or respond with the icy pause and dull eyes of the hotel receptionist who took her time glancing up each morning to answer my simple questions. Where is the museum? Are we close to the sea? Just because I'd paid, and not much, for a room, it didn't entitle me to more than her disdain. She was the host, and I was the guest required to await her hospitality. I'd asked for the route to town, and this morning where to swim. I'd seen photos of the refugees just months after liberation in bathing suits by the shore. Finally, she glanced up. No swimming, she said with a wan smile. The waters of Bari were far too polluted. As my room filled with grainy light, I tried again to imagine Renata in the years she stayed here, climbing the sea wall or descending into the mineral cool of the San Sabino Cathedral where relics lay behind a screen. I wondered what injuries she'd had after the camps and if she'd begun to heal among the 500 displaced people overseen by the Jewish Council. Perhaps, I thought, as shouts rose up from the hotel garden, she'd eaten pasta in the old town, as I had at the end of today's group tour. I'd do whatever I could to commune with her. After cycling past the castle, our guide led the group down the narrow alleys, then gestured to the women in a cobbled square. Beside them, 2 shirtless men. Closer, I saw their tattoos, the guns, the imperial eagle. Were they among the Kasapound members who'd intercepted an anti-fascist march and threatened an Eritrean woman with brass knuckles, chains and crowbars? Our guide was pointing out the rudimentary kitchens outside the old houses. Each detail charmed the group, who uploaded these scenes to their phones. Hashtag living my best life, Italygram, Puglia lovers, Old Town, summer vibes, I love Bari. But when I looked at the piazza, I could only imagine the outdoor kitchens in winter, the oppressive proximity of the houses, the icy wind tearing through and upsetting the women who were forced to cook outside. After the tour, the guide invited me to make pasta with a local woman. As Carmela mixed the dough, I showed them photos on my phone. Jewish refugees eating at a long table, walking a toddler by makeshift huts at the DP camp. The guide had spent his whole life in the town, and Carmela even longer. No, I don't know these places, he said. What about the lintel, I asked, which marked the site of the old synagogue built in 1310, discovered during renovations on a private home. He shook his head. No idea. I asked about the new refugees from Africa and Syria who were forced into slavery on the local tomato farms. In Australia, I said, boatloads of people were turned away or detained in barbaric conditions. Some children, so traumatised from their years in detention, suffered a syndrome compared to the stupors experienced in the concentration camps. As I said, slave labour, camp, horror, capo. The guide turned to Carmela, who was shouting at an old man lugging a gas bottle. As she rolled long strands of dough and spoke rapidly in Italian, he translated or glossed for me. The memory, he said, is in her fingers. What could she recall of the Jewish refugees who stayed in the town? Her eyebrows shot up. They talked, Carmela casting me sceptical looks as I fumbled with the dough. I broke into a sweat. After what felt like 10 minutes, then the guide turned back to me and without a word, shrugged. Carmela mocked my orecchietti, then said my method of jabbing a finger into the dough to form the curved shape she made with a rolling motion reminded her of a technique used in the north and known by those in the south as sticking a finger into the arsehole. Now, in the Hotel Romanazzi, as the blood moon reached its height, a cheer rose up from the garden. The delegates or the bridal party, I could no longer tell them apart. A line floated up. It was Kafka. Who else? You are not of the castle, and you are not of the village. You are nothing at all. I had no claim to the outsider life Kafka described, even if I was descended from it and felt its echoes. I could cross borders and disappear into a crowd. I was continually passing. I was essentially free. Renata had had none of those advantages. I realised that there may be no trace of the Jews who lived in the town, expelled again and again throughout history. I turned instead to the rising blood moon, the pines, the sea. I looked out toward the port and thought, okay then, these are the same skies and moon that hung over Renata after Auschwitz and before Palestine. I'd travelled 16,000 kilometres from home to stare at a building which once housed the last Jewish family in town. I'd circled 37 immaculately preserved cathedrals, looking for a lintel that no one recalled. Nothing to be found, even in the museum. And now there were more fascists than Jews in the town. Only one historian described the fields where the DP huts once stood. All that remains, he wrote, are the signs of those who destroyed history, the vast community of history destroyers. Was it Anselm Kiefer who said, "There is no such thing as an innocent landscape"? In the hotel garden, the faces of the crowd were flushed with alcohol or lunar light. Above, the moon was washed red like an organ exposed mid-surgery. I turned from the delegates' attempts at a human pyramid and their leader with his one arm raised, barking orders. Suddenly it seemed perfectly clear, this terror of the group I'd carried all my life. I pulled on the one dress I'd packed for my trip. The deep slashes at either side revealed my stippled rash, my pale, sunless skin. I could not be best like the Russian models in their Bari Insta posts, or love life like their men posing by the sea wall. I couldn't strike Hepburn poses in a cobbled lane with a line-blurring face filter, but I knew how to dissolve. Downstairs, I hovered outside the restaurant. I was ravenous. My skin throbbed with a strange heat. In the distance, the bride, a man spraying champagne in a golden arc. A host of kids swept silently by in white hooded robes like minor ghosts. Solitude was in my nature, but for Renata it had been imposed. None of her family had visited after the war. Who had she become to survive after she was deported at 16, then orphaned in Auschwitz, where the birch trees remain the only living witnesses to her parents' death? What do trees remember? What must they forget to survive, and more than that, to thrive? Thank you.
A few years ago, while researching how to use a sextant, I learnt the US Navy had just reinstated the teaching of the ancient art of celestial navigation as a third-year required subject, aka sextant studies, that small, ingenious, handheld instrument that allows you to navigate with just the horizon and one celestial body in sight. It wasn't just that power sources were sometimes failing on digital navigation systems or that they were being hacked. It was prompted by other things too, like the naval minesweeper that went aground on a World Heritage Site coral reef near the Philippines when its digital chart misplaced the obstacle. At the same time, relying too heavily on GPS coordinates, they failed stunningly to heed lighthouses, according to the Navy's own report. I feel fairly sure our next guest will approve of sextant studies. As we'll hear in his piece tonight, he asks, among other things, what can we read from the place we stand? What happens when we take in the measure of the world with the most rudimentary of measures? Daniel Sherell is an American climate movement organizer. He's led successful campaigns to phase out coal-fired power plants, to divest millions of dollars from the fossil fuel industry, to pass New York's Green New Deal bill, touted as one of the world's most ambitious climate plans. He works with labor unions across the US to combat climate change and reverse income inequality. The recipient of a Fulbright scholarship in creative writing and a regular contributor to The Guardian, Daniel is also the author of the recently published Warmth, Coming of Age at the End of Our World, named one of the 20 best nonfiction books of the year by Publishers Weekly. In the book, he asks how it feels to imagine a future and a family under the weight of climate change. Our guest from over a few patches of sea, Daniel Sherell.
I did not see the barn. The barn saw me. It caught my eye, as the saying goes. It locked me in its gaze as I drove past. The barn sat alone in a shining field of stubble, staring out at the road. The door of its mouth was ajar, and inside was a splinter of darkness. The rest of the scene was sun, pure sun, that lazy white midday light that sets the world in a stupor. This was in Maryland, by the way, that minor American state, down some country road. I remember I had somewhere to be and some when to be there. I couldn't stop at the barn. I ignored its silent invitation. Who would stop for a thing like this, a non-event, an old barn in a cut field? What explanation could I give to anyone, to myself? In the darkness of my pocket, in the depths of an unlit screen, the little red bar of the present marched across the face of my calendar. It dispatched old plans and appointments, erected new ones in their stead. A phalanx of deadlines amassing in the distance, its little ding, the trumpet, announcing their relentless arrival. The barn sat aloof in its field, smoothing its skirts of sun. It cared little for the dead lines in my pocket. It had a lot of time to spend, and it spent it liberally. It lavished that quiet little field. I was 2 minutes past, already a world away, when my hands took the wheel and turned the car around. They made a clumsy 3-point turn on an otherwise empty road. It took me a second to catch on, but I assented willingly, with only a twinge of guilt. Who would know, after all, if I stopped? I could leave my phone in the car. I could make it forget where I was. I could silence it, extinguish it altogether, while I snuck off to commune with the barn. It felt thrilling, pathetically, to turn that car around, like a minor prison break, like a hobo leaping from a boxcar. like my own life was still speeding along its tracks, but I'd managed to jump off in the middle of nowhere and run full tilt at the horizon. I raced back to the barn. I felt worried it would somehow disappear. But I rounded the bend, and there it still was, planted in its plot, dense with itself. I pulled off onto the gravel margin and stepped out. I was alone and off schedule. The barn, like a king, took no notice of my arrival, but continued gazing impassively across its domain. Around itself, it had amassed a small kingdom. It had coaxed creeping vines up its sides and let them dry into a brittle script. In its power, it held the woods at bay, the trees like a crowd of supplicants, hushed in reverence, keeping their distance out of respect. Each trunk was gray and leafless. A warm winter had passed recently into lukewarm spring. The stubble of last year's crop softened the folds of the field. The dirt itself was hard and dry. I walked up and put one hand on the barn. Instantly, the barn in my brain collapsed and was replaced by the barn at hand. No further negotiation was possible. Everything the barn might have been, every quality it might have had, was erased instantly by those that it did. Its mass, its height, the coarse grain of its flank. These were commands I had to follow, issued wordlessly by the one true barn, the king of the real. I peered through the door into the inner darkness. An enormous tractor sat there hunched like an animal. Its tires were huge, its body red metal. It harbored an unrealized rage, the threshing, crushing racket it might have made. But the barn had welcomed it in, had soothed it, put it to sleep. It rested now, like the trees and the sun and the undulating field. The tractor, even the tractor, was a part of that peaceable kingdom. But what did it all mean? What was this barn? To what ox could I yoke the fact of it? It had been built who knows when, decades ago, maybe a century, maybe two. Back when this low country of salt marsh and farmland, blue crabs scuttling through the cane brakes, rusted plows dragged through furrows of mud, when all of this was still freshly stolen. They painted the barn fresh red with a white silo. They put it on postcards to show everyone what was happening in the new world. Now it's weathered and its roof has holes. The tractor must get wet when it rains. So there's a meaning for the barn. Cenotaph for an empire in decline. Star-spangled, forgotten, rotting trace of the colonists. Or it's a refuge on high ground. Hot marsh water percolating up through the soil, year after year, until it drowns the tractor from below. Or it's a moody backdrop, a beautiful place to watch myself in the third person. I can pace and stare abstractly. I'm a protagonist in a movie who is understood to be thinking. I close the door and look again at the barn. Close up, it does not look like a story. It means nothing. Or rather, it doesn't mean anything. The barn is arbitrary. The barn is a non sequitur. The barn stands athwart the narrative and refuses to budge. It generates no suspense or resolution. It does not follow, and it has no followers. It has a place in the world and a glut of raw time, which it doles out in fistfuls to whoever's passing by. I walk to the back of the barn and out into the field. The sun is directly overhead. My phone is dead in the trunk of my parked car. I have an idea to walk across the field, to stand atop a hillock and look back at the barn. I have an image in my head of how it will look from afar. As I walk, that image unpeels again from the barn itself, becomes its own unauthorized thing. I savor it. I am excited. I reach the top of the rise and I turn. In that moment, everything changes. The barn is not as expected. I cannot tell you exactly how, just that it is far away now, white wood washed with light, a solid, separate something. Though we've tried, it seems, we cannot take it in. The barn is out there. The barn is happening, just not to us. Had you passed by that day, you would have seen halfway across the field a small man in a light sweater in the throes of revelation. But you wouldn't have passed by. That's the whole point. I stood right there for a very long time, but no one ever passed by.
Our final guest tonight is a multidisciplinary artist working across music, visual art, literature, and film. Having spent years touring the world with rock outfit Lester the Fierce, Anita Lester released her debut solo EP, Erato, in 2020. Anita is also an accomplished poet and storyteller, with her work appearing in over a dozen books. Anita is joined tonight by composer, oud player, and percussionist Yuval Ashkar. He's played with a wide range of musicians, but with his own band, Kamoon, Yuval plays traditional music informed by his training with Israeli, Arabic, Turkish, oud masters, and with an Egyptian master percussionist. Please welcome Anita Lester and Yuval Ashkar.
just before the nativity of dawn, I felt a calm, but with the sun it was gone. When darkness is the quietest company, your torch sang through my window. Talk to me. Now we stand at the foot of this endless mountain, drinking our fate from its holy fountain, turning our backs on the lovers, waiting for us to arrive. And that wolf at your door, he still had sharp claws, though he may have a plan. Is that plan really yours? And you turn your back on what you'll never know or never see. Let it go, let it be. A southern wind, sharpened like a knife on empty streets, cut through my steady life. I broke champagne on a boat full of dread, and wrapped my shaking hands around your head. Now we stand at the foot of this endless mountain, drinking our fate from its holy fountain, turning our backs on the lovers, waiting for us to arrive. And that wolf at your door, he still has sharp claws, though he may have a plan. Is that plan really yours? And you turn your back on what you'll never know or never see. Let it go, let it be.
To all of you, thank you for traversing land masses, bodies of water, and sundry mountain ranges with us tonight. I hope all you've heard and seen leaves you a little more alive to your own separate natures and the nature we all share. Before you head home tonight, I'd like to return to Mary Oliver and leave you with the final lines from one of her best loved poems. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over, announcing your place in the family of things. Thank you to all of tonight's writers who have come from near and far to share their words tonight. Marina Benjamin, Bryan Walpert, Simon Tedeschi, Kira Mayer Phillips, Karen Hitchcock, Mireille Juchau, and Danielle Sherell. To the Lady of Shadows behind us, are you here, Lynne Kent? That's you, Lynne. To our absurdly talented musicians, Anita Lester, Gideon Preiss, and Yuval Ashkar. For her cameo, Laurabelle Spirovsky. Thank you to all the Melbourne Jewish Book Week fairies out there doing the tireless work in the background to make all of this possible and bring you this inspired and thoughtful celebration of words and wonder. And a shout out to Alicia Watt backstage, Mark Wilkinson on sound, and Rob Hornbuckle on lights. Good night and good book week to you all.